Thank you very much for having me here today. And hopefully I can just give you a little bit of a snippet of the book and that you'll be encouraged to read it once I'm done. I thought about the presentation today and I thought, well, how best would I want to do this for you? And I've changed this 2 or 3 times. And so I thought it probably would be best if I gave you a little context about who I am and where I began. So I started in law enforcement in 1986. This was a very small mountain town. And it was my first experience, and I was very, very young. I do consider it being raised by wolves. I had a lot of brothers, and in fact, I was the only sworn female police officer on the Western Slope for many, many years. But the reason why I mentioned this is that that's really where I became fascinated with behavior. So one night, I was working by myself. I was the only police officer in the entire county that was working, and I got a call of a woman that was attempting suicide from the bridge that went over the Colorado River, so she was going to jump in the water. And those of us who are first responders know that we don't dare get close to somebody that's going to jump, particularly my size, because if you grab onto them and they make that jump, you're more than likely going to go over with them. So I stood back and I talked to her, tried to find out what was going on. We talked for maybe 10, 15 minutes, and she finally decided to come with me, and I took her to the jail, and then she was later transported to the mental health facility, which was probably 60 miles away from where I was at. The very next night, I had the assignment of transporting an elderly woman who must have been, at the time, 75 or 80, and I was taking her from the hospital to the jail, and then from the jail, she would be transported to the mental health facility. During our ride, she tells me what it's like to have, at the time, diagnosed with multiple personalities. So she shared that in one personality, she had perfect vision, and it was documented by doctors, and the other personalities needed glasses. And then she talked to me about what the personalities were like, and I was hooked. I think it was the next week that I enrolled into a master's program at Regis University, going for my clinical psychology degree. So in 1994, I got my degree, my master's degree, and then in 96, I decided to move from that small town to a much larger agency. Sometimes in a small town, you can kind of educate yourself right out the door. So I went over to the Arvada Police Department, and I started over. And about that time, I'd say I started there in 97. In 99, I decided it was time to go back. I wanted to get my doctorate because now I had this crazy desire to understand the behavior of cops, because we definitely are a crazy breed. So I had a postcard that I had kept for since 94 that was given to me by a fellow student at the time of graduation from my master's degree. If you ask my mother, she'd tell you I don't keep anything. In fact, if there's not a handle on it, it's gone within 3 or 4 months. So for me to keep this postcard was pretty amazing. So I had this postcard, and I decided that I was going to enroll in Saybrook University. Humanistic psychology, really wasn't sure if that was the direction I wanted to go, but I got there, and what happened is that the folks at Saybrook provided this really positive, supportive environment that was focused on positive change and growth within individuals. And so they really encouraged me to go in the direction that I was going to go in my research, which was looking at how does a cop stay healthy in the business. So a lot of the research that was done up until that point was really negative. It was how does police work affect the human being? And there wasn't much research out there, and the reason why is because it's a very secret society. We just don't say a lot in police work. And so I decided I really want to know why cops stay healthy, because there's a lot of us. So if you look at the numbers there, there's over 655,000 police officers in the United States and over 100,000 federal officers. And for the most part, there's a lot of officers that have great careers, that don't get into trouble, that stay healthy, and I wanted to know why. That was my passion. And so Saybrook really filled the bill as far as supporting me around that. So when I was interviewing those officers, that kind of led into where I'm heading with this particular book. But before I get there, what happened is I graduated from Saybrook in 2005, and I continued my research after I graduated. In 2008, I was contacted by the FBI. They wanted to do a conference with a bunch of us from around the world that were studying similar topics about cops staying healthy. So a bunch of us went to the FBI Academy and we presented our research, and I met my current research partner that's in the UK, and then I also met a brain doctor from Maharishi University. And so my research looked at how spirituality is incorporated in police work. And I know some people are going, spirituality in cops? No. But it's very, very true. So I had done several interviews up until that point, and I was having a conversation in 2009 with this brain doctor about, I wonder what that looks like inside of a cop's brain. What does spirituality look like? And he goes, I don't know. Let's find out. So we decided that we were going to do a small study based off of the larger group of individuals that I had interviewed. And so in 2010, we asked for volunteers, and we had 11 cops that volunteered to have EEG measures applied to their brains and take a look at what that actually looked like inside their brain. Well, about halfway through with the group, the brain doctor came out and he goes, this is incredible. I've never seen brains this fast before. And he'd been researching this for years. He said these guys are actually faster, guys and gals, than world-class athletes and top-level managers in the world. He said, in fact, their scores are very similar to somebody who's been meditating, transcendental meditation for over 25 years. So the really cool thing about that is that there were different types of spiritual practices. There was conservative Christian, there was Buddhist, there was atheist, there was just a general spirituality, and all of these cops were actually thinking and acting faster. And then I had one young man that I had interviewed. He was our last participant. And when I interviewed him, he was in uniform and he was in his police department, and he cried during the interview. And he was a very, very good cop, but he was very spiritually distressed. He didn't think that there was anything outside of himself, anything that he could hold on to. And so we had him do the same tests. He agreed to do those, and his scores completely bottomed out. So then we're thinking, this is really exciting, because it shows that when the emotional field is exhausted and the person can't think outside, then their scores, they get tired. The brain gets tired. But if they can pull from outside of themselves, they actually still function far faster in the brain quadrants. So again, that's where the research led to in 2010. So what's interesting about that is that as I was interviewing, as I was living in the Petri dish, and then watching the police culture, I started noticing that there were things that were disturbing as far as our police culture. And then in 2013, we all saw that there was an increase of these shootings. Now, for whatever reason, whether there were more cameras on the street or there were just more shootings, I can't really say, but about 2013 is when we really saw the dramatic increase. The interesting thing is that we're talking about outliers. So when you look at an outlier, that's a really important thing in research, because that's outside of the assigned or the defined area. But the outliers are the ones that are actually having a tremendous effect on the entire area. And so that's the really difficult thing. So we have a lot of cops that are doing great work, but it's being way overshadowed by these outliers on the outside, because there were a lot of police shootings last year, and almost all of them were justified. There were just a few that were questionable and criminal. But those few caused a tremendous amount of distrust in our communities. And so that's when I decided that I was going to look at the whole system of policing. All right, so I came up with these three topics today to talk to you about. So the first one is stress. Now, our police communities are completely consumed with stress. And really what that means is fear. So there's fear of community, there's fear of being vulnerable, there's fear of loss of control, there's fear of getting in trouble, of getting fired. All of that fear is inside the police communities. And I know you can ask a police officer, like, no, I'm not afraid, but they are. What happens when we're under stress, for those of us that understand the brain, we have basically three portions of our brain. So we have the frontal lobe here, which is the newest portion of our brain. And in that frontal lobe is where our hope, our ethics, our compassion, our morals, our higher level thinking, our problem solving is located. But when we're under stress, it's just like a computer. It goes offline. So we just might as well set it aside. So what happens then is we're functioning in the middle part of our head, which is the limbic system. And in the limbic system, that's where your survival mechanisms are. So that's where you're wired for anger, fear, and aggression. There's no hope in there. It's anger, fear, and aggression, because that's what keeps you surviving. So it's fight or flee. So I think that's really critical when we look at how our police interacting in our communities. So if they're under stress and they're acting from an animalistic perspective and set that frontal lobe aside, and then they go out into a community that's marginalized and fearful, traumatized, and stressed, it's amazing we don't have more violence. Because what we have is prey and predator. So that's what it looks like. Okay, next one is implied bias. We don't teach this to police officers at all. We don't really teach this much to many people, but it's so important. So I teach this to my students, and I have them go to the Harvard website for implicit association tests, and I have them take 2 or 3 of the tests for the psychology class. So they may take one on gender or race or religion or on gender roles or something like that. And invariably, they come back the next day and they're furious with me. I'm not a racist. I'm not a homophobe. And they're just angry. And I said, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's talk about what this means. Implied bias is that under level, that unconscious belief system that you don't know you have until something comes up. So then I give them a description about stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. And I said, let me tell you, I'm going to confess right now what my prejudice is. I said, when I hear the ridiculous music of an ice cream truck, I think pedophile. I'm not thinking, I'm going to get a fudge stickle or an ice cream sandwich. Invariably, I think there's a pedophile on that truck. Okay, so then I ask my students, now I want you to ask me how many times I've arrested a pedophile out of an ice cream truck. And they ask, and I said, 0. In 27 years, I've never arrested a pedophile out of an ice cream truck. But when I hear that music, I know there's a pedophile in the neighborhood. So I said, that's why it's so important, because I have no idea where that came from. I don't even know any of my police buddies that have arrested a pedophile out of an ice cream truck. And yet I have this belief. And so what I'm saying is that this unconscious belief or bias or prejudice may lurk beneath the surface. All of a sudden you're placed in a situation and you don't know you have that. So then you begin to act out in a way that maybe is consistent with that belief, but you don't know why. So if we teach them, let's look at those and see what those are, we stand to have a better opportunity for our officers to have success, instead of just throwing them in a situation where they might have some implied bias or prejudice about something and then expecting them to swim out and be fine. The last one is communication. So communication, we are horrible at this. But then we add people who come to us now that have a device in their hand or next to their head or something in their lap. And so they're really not very good at communicating either. But we don't communicate very well in our organizations. I can remember growing up as a cop, and the rule of thumb from my sergeants was, if you don't hear from me, you're doing a good job. Well, that doesn't work, especially with this generation. They want feedback, right? The other thing is that when we don't teach communication, we don't teach the higher level of thinking in our frontal lobes. So let's go from the East Coast to the West Coast. A police officer goes through 20, 21 plus weeks of training in order to be a cop. And within that 21-week academy, they learn how to shoot, and they drive fast, and they arrest people, and they write reports, and they learn about the law. And the number of hours of communication skill and de-escalation techniques on the East Coast is 4 hours. 4 hours is required. Let's go to the West Coast. California, 0. In Colorado, I think it's about maybe 6. So think about that. We give them a gun, stick it in their hand. We give them car keys. we put pepper spray on their belt, and we give them a baton, and we say, go out and be professional, and they have no idea how to do that. So that's one of the major flaws that we have within the system, too. All right. So here we are at the police pursuit of the common good. When I looked at this, I thought, we have to be talking about this from the system, from the culture. This is really the key here, and nobody's done this yet. So for those of you who may not know, Dr. Philip Zimbardo, he did the Stanford prison experiment, some of the most unethical research out there, and yet some of the most powerful, important research there is on social behavior. Because what he talks about when he watched his students and himself become corrupt with a bunch of college kids being guards and prisoners, he talks about the importance of the situation and the effect it has on the behavior of the individual. So when you looked at the video and you saw the Rodney King incident, that was 25 years ago in March, okay? What did we learn from that particular time? Not much, because what we decided to do is say, that's a bunch of bad apples, okay? But here's the problem. Are they all bad apples? Did we just happen to have this really interesting coalescing of the energy, and we had all these guys just all of a sudden show up and they're a bunch of bad apples? And if that's the case, then we need to start looking at how we're vetting these people to be cops. Because now we're talking about psychologicals and polygraphs and interviews that are failing. Or could it be the culture and the system that maybe is sick? Okay? Dr. Zimbardo was actually contacted to be a consultant on the situation that happened with the military in Abu Ghraib, where those young military officers did horrible atrocities to prisoners within a relatively short period of time. And he said, this is really important to look at. This is not a bunch of bad apples. This is a system. And a lot of times what happens with the system is we have this hands-off approach from our higher-ups. And so what happens is then they have to decide, well, who's the leader? And if I can get away with this, maybe I can do a little bit more. And that's how the system starts getting sick. Okay? So that's where I decided to go with this and look at it. So in 2010, let's back up. I was actually in the UK, and I was doing some research, my research, and I talked to a police chief constable over there. And I was asking him some of my standard questions, and he said, you Americans, you have no idea how to police. Well, I was a cop at the time, and I was like, bet me. But I decided to be quiet because I was a researcher at the time, and so I just needed to kind of calm down. He said, we've done CompStat. We've done the accountability programs. We've done the number-based programs, and they don't work. What we do is we send the cop into the community, and we have that cop ask, how do you want to be policed? We ask the elderly, we ask the juveniles, how do you want to be policed? And I thought, that's a brilliant question. So I tucked that question next to me, and I flew home. And at the time, we were getting ready in Arvada Police Department to go to decentralized policing, which, in my opinion, is another fracturing of our communication. So I was talking with the police chief and the command staff, and I said, isn't this a great question? Maybe we ought to think about doing this instead of fracturing our department. And they looked at me like I had 4 heads. And I thought, okay, not here, not now. Tucked the question back in, went on and did my career. However, when I retired in 2013, I said, I'm going to retire. 27 years is enough for me. I want to make a difference to this police community. I want to help cops, and I can't do it within one agency. So I'm going to retire and devote myself to research and academia. And then I started seeing the shootings. And then they started increasing. And then in 2015, I met a young man that was giving a spoken word piece, which is like an animated poetry or kind of a rap, if you don't know what that's like. And it was very controversial. It was done in front of the Modesto Police Department. And it was done in front of the community that was going in for this event. And I thought, put my money where my mouth is. And so I pulled him aside after he was done, and I said, can I interview you? And he agreed. And so he's in the book. And so a month later, I sat down with him, and I asked him the question. I said, Barry, how do you want to be policed? And he looked at me and said, I mean, he was so appreciative and so happy. And he said, I've never had anybody ask me that. And I said, well, I'm asking you now, how do you want to be policed? And he said, I want to be policed from a distance. And I said, I'm thinking, that's not going to work in a high crime area. That's not going to work. But then I shut up and let him continue. And what he talked about is, he says, as a young black male in a marginalized community, what happens is you get in that community, and when it's a bad community and lots of cops are there, that means something really bad is going to happen. And there's a lot of fear around that. He said, when you go to a nice neighborhood and there are a lot of cops in the area, you feel safe. He said, but not in a neighborhood that's not a good neighborhood. He said, so when the police come in, you're always afraid you're going to do something wrong. It's like being oppressed. He said, I can't breathe. I can't walk in my streets without feeling like I'm going to have something happen to me. And I thought, my God, when you think about that, when you think about young men that are having this difficulty, men and women, that's terrible. We're creating this fear for this community. We're perpetuating it by over-policing them. So he went on to say, he actually talked further, and he said, and I want to know who you are. I want to know who you are in my community. I want to know your first name. I want to know what church you go to. He said, and then I want to know, maybe you can help me police my neighborhood so you don't have to be here as much. Maybe you can teach me about what I need to look for in a burglary, or what I need to do if somebody's showing signs of mental illness. And I was thinking, this is a brilliant idea and a community solution. So if we looked at mentoring from the point of not inside the police department, because inside the police department we have formal and sometimes informal mentoring programs. I'm talking about the community mentoring police. So if we look at what happens now, Barry explained to me, he says, I had an older cousin teach me how to talk to white people. I was ashamed, and he said, and he taught me how to talk to cops too, what to say, what to do, how to smile, make sure that my hands are visible. And I thought, why are we not teaching cops how to talk to community? And what was interesting is that all of the participants that are inside the book said the same thing. Really common theme here. And so I thought, well, what if you had somebody like, maybe you had a kid that was interested in going into law enforcement, but maybe that kid got into a little bit of trouble. He was tagging a bridge, or maybe there was some graffiti. What if that cop could connect with that kid and say, hey, can you teach me about this? Teach me why this is important to you. Why do you have this need to do this on a bridge? I know it must be art for you, but here it's blight, and so we need to talk about that. And oh, by the way, you do want to be a police officer, so how are we going to mentor you in order to get you there? Or maybe there's somebody that comes from the community corrections system. Maybe it's a young male or female that says, I've been convicted of fraud and forgery, but I want to make a clean life. And that person connects with a cop and teaches that cop how to look for signs in that community, or explain why that's important to him, or what are the reasons why he or she went that direction and ended up getting arrested. And perhaps we can offer a stipend to that individual, just a small amount of money. So there's actually meaning for both parties and a partnership for both parties to work together and get to know each other and actually begin to communicate. So that was one of the other things in the book too. What we teach cops right now are the 3 rules. Don't talk, don't trust. Don't talk, don't trust. I've lost the other one. Can you believe that? I'll think of it. Anyway, those 3 rules are actually the rules in every dysfunctional home. We don't teach them how to interact with people, so we isolate them. We actually keep cops away, and they begin to think about us versus them. So Sir Robert Peel said it 1829, the police are the community and the community are the police. I think he said public. We need to actually begin to become the community, because what we have done is actually become marginalized ourselves. We're on the outside. We're not in the culture anymore. By doing what we've done in our culture, we've become marginalized. So here's another study that was done. This was done in the UK by a woman in 2013. She interviewed 350 police constables, and 79% said that they did not feel supported by their organization. 40 to 48% were actually deemed to be at medium to high risk for burnout and or post-traumatic stress. and 13% had actually been signed off by a doctor for over 4 months with a stress-related problem in the UK. The cost of that was 99 million pounds. In the US, that would be 143 million, give or take. So what that really said to me from my experiences as a police officer living in the Petri dish, from what I heard from cops who were actually talking about how they incorporate their spirituality, but said they weren't supported. So they were able to maintain their resilience, maintain their communication and drive, but they still weren't supported by the organization. And then this other study demonstrates that they don't feel cared for. So if you're in an organization or a system that's sick and is not caring for its individuals, and then that organization goes out into community, there's no way that they can take care of community. Absolutely no way. So I'm talking about police leaders and police chiefs looking inside. This is a simple answer, but it requires a hell of a lot of effort. A lot of effort. But it's worth it to sit there and look at that badge and say, what does this actually mean to me? Does this mean authority and control? Does it mean power? Or when I look at that badge, does it mean public trust? Because that's how it was given to me, was public trust. And then look inside and say, how am I creating a culture in this organization? And am I creating a culture of service, or am I creating something else? And then turning to command staff and saying, what are we doing in order to promote a culture of service? Because if we can take care of our coppers, and they feel valued and there's meaning and purpose in what they do, I guarantee you they're going to turn right around and do that in community. I guarantee you they're going to do that. I want to tell you that there are people that are doing this around the United States already to some form. Lieutenant Colonel Melvin Russell from Baltimore Police Department was actually doing some of this right before the Freddie Gray incident. When Freddie Gray was arrested and then died, they had obviously tons of protests and violence, and he was actually contacted by all the leading gang members. And they said, we don't want to be a part of this. We don't want the media thinking that we're creating this violence. And he said, okay, meet me at the corner of such and such. And those gang members met him every night, and they helped disperse the crowds every night for a period of time. So what he does right now, because there's obviously a new chief in town, and this new chief is actually for some of the things that he's doing, he actually puts clergy with cops. Now, it's not to heal something between the cop and the clergy. The clergy is designed to go into the community and help the community. But what happens in the meantime is that the clergy actually teaches the cop how to talk to community. And then there's a relationship with the clergy, because it's really hard to sin in front of a clergy, right? So there's more ethics involved there. So it really works. What he talks about is, instead of looking at numbers, when you get into those communities, crime actually takes care of itself. Sergeant Renee Mitchell from Sacramento Police Department, she has started a society. It's called the American Society for Evidence-Based Policing, and I hope to work with her in the future. But she's also looking at the inconsistencies in our police training as far as not communicating with our coppers and not teaching them how to de-escalate these particular situations. And then another one is Scott Thompson. He's the chief of Camden, New Jersey. And he just reinstituted community policing. So in 2012, they lost a bunch of their police officers through budget cuts, and then quickly realized that they needed to bring them back. And then they realized that they really should have police officers from Camden, New Jersey. Because if the officer is not from the area, there's not much commitment. So if you've got a New York cop that comes in and helps police Camden, New Jersey, he or she spends 8 to 10 hours there on a shift, and when that shift is done, they're like, I'm out of here. Whereas if there's someone from Camden, New Jersey who's bought in and says, I want to change something, I want to be here and affect the community, that makes a huge difference. And so they're walking the beat and they're talking and communicating with the police or with the community in Camden, New Jersey, and seeing an effect. So it's being done. Hopefully I've whet your appetite enough that you'll want to read the book. And I'm available for questions. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Well, back in the mid-90s, I used to work a lot in Chicago, inner city community groups. And one thing that they mentioned that you didn't mention that they thought was a key element. I was sitting around with a group one day on the west side and asking why, when a crime is committed, you don't come forward. And they said that's because the police don't come forward. They don't do it either. They're just like us. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, even the police that we have really good relationships with, when they see a fellow officer do something, they never do anything about it. So we understand that they will never squeal on each other. Yeah. So why should we tell on anybody out of our community? And to me, that was a real awakening.
Yeah.
That the police are actually modeling the very behavior, in many instances, not all, but the very behavior that they don't want, that blue line of protecting. By the way, when I work in the medical area, doctors do it too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's not just the police. Yeah. But that's a key issue that I think has to be addressed first and foremost. That when you see something going wrong, you have to blow the whistle on your fellow officer immediately and now. That's the best way to get into the community and to get the community trust. That they know that they can have a relationship where they'll actually be protected and not just covered up and not corrupted.
You're absolutely right. It's in the book. I just kind of gave you enough to wet your whistle here with this. I've experienced it myself where I tried to bring, there were several times where I brought corruptness in my organization. And it's either ignored or I understand that, while I didn't work with unions, I understand that unions can be very problematic for that. But that pushing it aside or we bury it, if you look at the Rodney King incident, that's what happened. All that stuff was kind of buried and not addressed, and it's easy to do when you don't look at the system. Because if you look at the system, you have to look at the police leaders in the system because they're part of it. So you can't say, oh, that's just a bad apple, and I don't have anything to do with it. You need to look at it and go, I have something to do with this. How did that happen on my watch? So you're right, absolutely. Yes, sir.
I've been involved with issues of police-community relations now since 2009, doing some investigations and doing some advocacy work. Bottom line is you're correct about leadership, but I see it as two things, leadership and discipline. If you don't have both, you don't have a good police department. You need to have both. The second thing is, as Joe was saying, if you have 1 out of 100 policemen doing wrong, it's 100 doing wrong if nothing happens. So it's the 99% that are doing right that need to take care of the 1% doing wrong.
Right.
Third comment is that some years ago, I did some training and I asked a bunch of young people, what is a policeman's symbol of authority? That is not the symbol of authority.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's what a lot of young people think. Yeah. But the bad guys have guns too.
Yes.
So
yes.
The question becomes, who is responsible? Who has to take the lead in changing the police-community relations? Is it the community or is it the police?
Well, even though I'm retired, I call myself part of the we, because I've been a cop for almost half my life. It's up to me. That's why I'm here. It's up to the police culture. They're the ones that have to change it first. And I know cops get defensive about this. They say, oh, no, you just don't understand what it's like. They don't have to understand what it's like. There's an imbalance in the relationship because one of us has a gun. I mean, I understand that criminals have the gun too, but when we come to have a relationship, we have the gun. And so there's an imbalance in power. And as hard as it is for the 99 officers that have not done anything wrong, we all have to dig down and say, I'm sorry, let's start again, let's try this, we need to make this right. And then eventually the community will come back to us. However, I will tell you that just in interviewing the young men and women that I interviewed with the book, they were more than willing to talk to me, a former police officer. They were more than willing to share this and express what they felt needed to be done.
There's Illinois, Governor signed a new law into effect in Illinois in September of last year. Went into effect in January, and that is entitled the Police Community Relations Act, something like that. And it has some specific responsibilities for enforcement on policemen. One of them is that when you stop someone with a stop and frisk routine, you got to give them a receipt now. You just don't stop someone, pat them down, and send them on the way. You got to write something up about it. That's one. Another major provision of that law has to do with eavesdropping. This is what has brought this whole thing of police-community relations to the forefront. Illinois made an exception to the eavesdropping law that if you're photographing or recording a policeman doing his job, it's legal to do that unless it puts the officer in danger.
Yeah.
But other than that, that's the tool that people need to have when they confront policemen. I had a case where a situation where I was driving home with my wife down Gulf Road and get pulled over by a Glenview policeman. Walks up, driver's license and insurance, please. So I hand them both to him. He said, well, now, George. I said, well, wait a minute. There are two names on that driver's license. The second name is my surname. I prefer you call me by that. And he looked at me. I looked at him and said, well, maybe I'm going to be arrested today. But he changed it and said, okay, Mr. Mitchell, and gave me my stuff back. That's another thing. It's a symbol of respect.
Yes.
That's not exercised by most police departments.
Yes. I would agree. Yes.
My question for you is, how do you see kind of modern technology and things like social media playing into this? And the reason I ask, my community here in Chicago has a community watch page, and our beat cop is on that community watch page. I know who she is. She knows who all of us are. And I never really thought about it from this perspective. It just kind of was an everyday thing for me. But it seemed, now that hearing your comments, it seems like that could be a really interesting model for bringing cops closer to communities. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful idea because we obviously have to figure out ways to communicate, and some of that is social media. I know that I have talked to a couple of different police departments, and I've heard people ask them, well, we don't know what's going on with you. We don't know the meetings that are occurring. And why are you only having a meeting occurring in a wealthy area? Why aren't you having it over on this side of the city? And the common response that I've received so far is, well, you can just check our website. And that's the mistake, is that it really becomes the police agencies. We have to demand that they be able to say, okay, let me get that information to you, or have somebody that can get that information to you, or I'll be right back with you, or can you shoot me an email so I can send you something? Making the effort to say, I really am interested in you and you being aware of what's going on. So
in
yes.
our case, it's flipped. The community calls the meeting and invites the cop.
That's wonderful.
And the cop comes.
So there's obviously that level of trust that has ensued.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
Having grown up in a police family, not in the United States, but in another part of the world, I believe I have a balanced empathy for what the police have to face on a daily basis. I grew up in Ireland, and for example, we would have never been permitted to use the word cop because it's considered disrespectful. So there's a respect communicated that is reciprocal in calling officers police officers at all times, much as a police officer would call somebody sir or ma'am. I work in Los Angeles, and the Chicago School has done a lot of work with the LAPD, specifically the officers in the South Central region, and I believe they've been quite exemplary and even contemporary in their efforts with the community. Just last week, I was approached by one of the officers who, on behalf of the police officials in the region, are beginning what they're calling a police and community bias program, and invited the Chicago School of Professional Psychology to engage with them to develop a curriculum that could be taught in our clinical forensic programs and so
Excellent.
on, and also extended across the nation potentially to raise my original point, and that is that we forget sometimes how difficult a police officer's job is. To your point earlier, they really are under a tremendous amount of stress on a daily basis. The stress has been exaggerated lately because of those small number of outliers. That's made it very difficult for everyone. So to my question, South Central are attempting to do restoration meetings, particularly when a member of the community believes that they have been approached by a police officer because they've been profiled. And the restoration is really very simple. The community member is invited in to have a conversation with the police officer who pulled them over or stopped them, asked them a question, arrested them, whichever. And they have a mutual opportunity to explain each other's position to each other. They have had over 20% of the community members that have been stopped by the police come in to engage in the restoration. And what I respect about it is that not only does it give the member of the community an opportunity to say, I believe that I was profiled, or I believe that I was mistakenly identified, there wasn't a necessity for the force, I believe, and so on. But it also gives the police officer an attempt or an opportunity to say that this is why you were pulled over, or this is why you were stopped. And then they attempt to reciprocally understand each other. So my question is, it's a very complex matter, both for the community, but for the police officers that are also on the line every day. What are your thoughts within this about that sort of restorative work in the community? So it's not about the police, it's not about the community, but there's a reciprocal responsibility to make things better and healthy. So is it one or both? Is it all? Are programs like that worth investing in and extending?
Absolutely, because that is actually the beginning of the partnership and the conversation. And that's really what hasn't been happening. So it may look different. I'm not saying that what I present today is exactly what needs to happen. There are pieces that are going to look different, but the whole point is starting the conversation, getting the fact that there's fear out there so we can talk about the fear, because if we don't talk about it, it doesn't dissipate. It just stays there. And letting the police officer and the community actually have that conversation. This is the way it looks from both perspectives so that people begin to understand. Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Yes, sir.
So just following a little bit on that, and again, thank you very much. Great insights. But you talked about implied bias. It seems to me that there's another part within the police force, which is what I would call, and maybe it's a wrong terminology, learned bias, in which you actually, because of your interaction with, investigations and crime, you don't believe anybody.
Right.
You believe you walk up to somebody, they're not going to tell you the truth.
Right.
And so in your model, do you differentiate between implied bias and learned bias? And how do you get police officers to be aware that they're going to develop biases because of the job?
Again, there would be more training communication for them. As far as learned bias, that sometimes that happens within any particular profession, but it really takes that communication with their supervisors and somebody that appear in order to say, this is what it's going to look like. And a lot of times we don't do that with the cops. And so we don't take them by the hand and say, this is what it looks like when you're under stress. And when you see something really horrible, you need to talk about it. Because if you don't talk about it, it just sits back here. And actually that piece of the brain begins to die. And then that's where we start to see post-traumatic stress disorder, because it's not moved up in front where people can actually just have that as a memory. There's emotion attached to it. And so when we start to have these conversations about all aspects of that, this is what's going to happen to you. Understand that. And bringing wives and boyfriends and husbands in to say, this is what it looks like when your husband or wife or partner is not doing well. And when you see these things. So absolutely, we need to have more conversation. Yes, sir.
So I wonder how your research plays out in neighborhoods that have a heavy gang problem.
I think some of what happens is that, and this is human nature, is that we forget to look at behavior, and we're looking at people. And we're assigning behavior to people or to groups of people, and that begins the downward spiral. Because certainly while gangs are a very tough issue, if we can look at it from another point of view, at least just expand our view about that. This very dysfunctional family. So many of these kids that haven't had a solid family will seek out this gang family because as dysfunctional it is, they feel some sense of belonging. So if we can approach things from a different perspective, and I'm not saying that we're saying to a cop, hey, go ahead and get shot. I'm saying that we take a look at just behavior, being aware of behavior, and have conversations with that. I mean, obviously Baltimore was able to do that with the leaders of the gangs in that city, where they said, we want to help you. We want to be a part of the community and help you disperse this. And so he met with each of those gang members. And they did that on those city streets. Now, does that work everywhere? Absolutely not. Are we going to eliminate crime? Absolutely not. But we're at least going to begin to try and heal the divide between marginalized communities that are affected by these types of behavior.
Well, on behalf of all of us, thank you, Dr. Charles, for the inspirational work you're doing, and thank you very much for coming and spending your time with us as well. And,
Thank you.
providing us with the book, and we look forward to reading it. Very much appreciate your effort.
Thank you very much.